All right, it is 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today for our webinar. With me today, I have our Executive Director, John Wilbeck. He'll be helping with the presentation when need be and monitor the chat box for any questions. If you guys have questions during the presentation, feel free to use that chat box feature and we will answer them as they come in. And John will, if something's needing to be addressed, maybe to the group, we'll address it then, but otherwise that's how we're going to have our little Q&A. Additionally, we're recording the webinar, so if you have any want to go back and watch again or review or anything, we will have that available on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and review that. Additionally, I will have the slides available on the website under resources under that webinar option. As a reminder, no certificate's going to be issued for this. We will send you an email with an attendance verification if you attended the entirety of the presentation. As a reminder, we do anticipate the board is going to give credit for the webinar, but the board does not pre-approve any CE offerings. So with that little review, we'll go ahead and get started. We want to go, here we go. So our roadmap, first we're going to just do a quick overview of the board. Then we're going to look at when architects and engineers are going to be required on a building project. And then we're going to get into how to avoid that design practice when working in the lumberyard profession. And then look at the complaint process and investigations to see what happens, when that line gets crossed into design practice, what can happen. And then we're going to look at a few case studies the board has seen to show how that process plays out and what was learned for the individual who is engaged in that unlicensed practice. All right, so first we're just going to do a little overview of the board and our act. So a little bit about who we are. Back in the 1920s and 30s, Nebraska experienced several unfortunate incidents. They had a dam collapse, flooding from an unproven water system, and the failure of a schoolhouse foundation. As a result of these incidents, the board was created to protect health, safety, and welfare through regulating the practice of engineering and architecture. And this bill was then signed into law effective August 16, 1937. So here is our current board members. We have 4 professional engineers, 3 architects, and 1 member of the public. We do have 1 professional engineer and 1 architect who is a faculty member of the University of Nebraska. And so right now we have Bruce Dvorak, who is in the engineering department over at UNL, and Brian Kelly, who is in the architecture department at UNL. And those individuals are recommended by the dean of their respective program. Board members are appointed by the governor to serve 5 terms. And their responsibility is to ensure that our board rules and statutes are upheld in the state. And so the 2 primary missions of the board, they ensure that architects and professional engineers are qualified to practice. So they make sure that those individuals applying for licensure have the education, the exams, and experience that's required. And then they also enforce the act, particularly those that require when a design professional is needed on a project. We typically see this type when a member of the public designs or allows a project to be built on their land without a licensee involved if needed to be. Additionally, this can also include incompetence on behalf of a licensee. So there are various ways of the investigations, but the unlicensed practices usually are most common. So our handbook, this contains the act and our board rules and regulations. The first section is going to be the statutes, and most recent changes were on May 6th of 2025. The second section are board rules and regulations that were written by the board to administer the statutes and cannot exceed the statutes. And the most recent changes were on November 25th, 2025. So again, this is our handbook. That governs the practice of engineering and architecture in the state. Make sure we are safeguarding that life, health, property, and promoting public welfare.
Allison, can I jump in just a second here before we move on to this next one? So I did want to let the licensees know there was a bill introduced in this session that was passed by the legislature. It modified a few things in the act for licensees. Really, the only thing that active licensees need to care about is we changed some of the seal provisions. The statutes prior to this year said that when you apply your signature and date to a seal, it has to be across the seal. Now, starting on July 17th, you will be allowed to put your signature and date either across or adjacent to the seal. The key is for everyone that it has to be legible. And so what was happening was the board ran into some instances of, maybe a licensee used to, thick ink on their signature when they applied it. So it was tough to kind of read both the signature and the seal. So the board looked at some statutes of other states and saw a few that were allowing the signature and date to be adjacent to the seal. So that's going to be allowed in starting July 17th. The other thing, which again won't probably apply to most everyone, because hopefully all the licensees, but for anyone who's not yet licensed, the board is moving to direct registration for the PE exam. So prior to July, applicants who wish to take the PE exam for purposes of licensure will still need to apply to the board. But after July 17th, they won't need to. They can just go to NCEES, and NCEES will manage all those PE exam candidates. We've instructed NCEES to check to make sure they have passed the FE and that they have met our minimum education requirements, which are the typical ABET EAC degree or meet the NCEES education standard. So the big thing for licensees right now that's changing starting on July 17th is you can now put your signature and date of application adjacent to the seal, again, so it's all legible. So just wanted to add that before you move on. Thanks, Allison.
Oh, yep, no problem. It's good information to get out there.
Yep.
All right, so before we get into the nuts and bolts of avoiding design practice on building projects, we're going to need to first figure out when an architect or professional engineer are required on a building project. So when we look at this, the first thing we're going to look at is if that work comprises of the practice of architecture and engineering. So we're going to look at those definitions. So state statute defines architecture as providing or offering to provide design services in connection with the construction, enlargement, or alteration of a building or group of buildings and the space within and surrounding the buildings. So as an example, architects are going to look at ADA codes, historical requirements, and aesthetics. And then when we look at engineering, this is going to be any service or creative work that requires engineering education, training, experience in the application of special knowledge of the mathematical, physical, and engineering sciences. So engineering is going to focus more on the math, the calculated weight of materials, physics behind the structure, structural elements, snow loads, HVAC, and things of that nature. So if you're not sure if the project involves the practice of architecture or engineering, best thing to do is going to be to reach out to a licensee. So are architects and engineers interchangeable? Some of what they do may look similar. Like it says there, creating plans, designs, drawings, technical submissions. The practices are very separate and distinct. Architects can't practice engineering, and professional engineers can't practice architecture unless they're duly licensed. And some projects can require one or can require both. So we've defined what the practice is, and next we're going to look at whether that work is exempt from the E&A Act. So we're going to look at occupancy classifications and exemptions. These two are going to help us decide, again, if that building project needs a design professional. So when we say occupancy classification, this is going to categorize a structure based on its primary usage. Like it says there, a home's main purpose is going to be that residential. Hospital's main purpose is healthcare. The occupancy classification is going to be found in the state building code, and this is often referenced by the board, code officials, and the state fire marshal's office. It'll also typically be given to you by that state fire marshal or the local code official. And this is going to be a vital first step in determining if you're going to need a design professional on your project. So we have our occupancy classification table here that was developed by the board from state law. Again, this is going to categorize those structures based on their primary usage. And we use this to determine the maximum allowable building area that can be built without a licensed architect or professional engineer. Additionally, when we're looking at those lumberyard professionals, when you have a customer who comes in and has a question about a project or showing you a project, this is going to be a good first step in knowing if this is something that you can assist with in designing. Because once it hits that square footage, like for an assembly, once it hits that 1,000 square feet, then more than likely we're going to need a design professional on it.
Yeah, and let me just add this for those who are not aware of where occupancy classifications come from. They are referenced in the state building code, which is, I can't recall the state statute offhand, but the state building code is referenced in our board rules that refer back to the state building code. And I think right now it's, I can't recall what version of the IBC it is, but the International Building Code published by ICC typically has those definitions of what constitutes each occupancy classification, what types of projects are categorized in each classification. So that's the reference, the state building code, which points to the International Building Code.
Yes. All right, so we have those occupancy classifications and that maximum building area here. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
John.
let's pause right here. There's a couple
Okay.
questions regarding this chart that I wanted to talk about. Paul asked, does the maximum building area apply to the existing structure or just the addition? So when you're dealing with additions, this rule kind of applies also, but the calculation, or you come up with the area by the total area that's adversely impacted. You don't just look at the square footage of the addition, right? Because you have to look at all of the square footage that addition adversely impacts. For example, if you're putting an addition on a building and that addition is intricately tied into the existing structure, the structural system of the existing structure, you can make a pretty good argument that you're adversely impacting all of the existing space. So you count all the existing structure as well. So the way you kind of determine the area adversely impacted is kind of explained in Rule 10.4, which is the next rule after this.
Yep.
So
We'll touch on that here in a little bit too.
Yeah,
Mhm.
hopefully that'll
Yep.
be a little clear. Just wanted to, before we move ahead, there was a question about investigative reports, such as those for insurance investigations determining extent of storm damage. They could be, again, engineering or architectural practice, meaning if to prepare that report takes anything that meets the definition of the practice of architecture engineering, and unless otherwise exempt from the act, that work is the practice of both of those, and it would have to be sealed. So that's addressing Timothy's question. And Christian asks about the seal, stamp and signature are only to be permitted. It's an either or. You can continue on as you are and place your signature and date across the seal. Now there's just a second option you can place that adjacent to the seal as well. So Christian, you can continue to do it the way you're doing it. So yeah, and then Matt, yeah, he points out the correct version of the IBC with some amendments. Okay. That's all I wanted to add there.
Okay. And I'll say, John, when you are asking about agricultural buildings, I'll get there in here in a little bit as well.
Gotcha.
So. All right, so next we're going to look at multiple occupancies. It's pretty common for structures to have more than one occupancy. So when we have one of those structures that has 2 or more occupancies, we're going to use the most restrictive occupancy classification when deciding if you need to get a licensee involved. So below we do have a example. We're just gonna call it a brew pub. So we're gonna say the factory is gonna be where that beer is made. Hazardous is where potentially hazardous materials are stored. Assembly is going to be the tasting room. Mercantile is going to be that store where you can buy goods. So we have 4 different occupancy classifications here. So let's look at the chart to determine what is going to be the most restrictive occupancy classification. So we have that assembly, that's 1,000 square feet. Factories at 5,000, hazardous is 2,000, and mercantile is 3,000. So since assembly is going to be the most restrictive occupancy, as it is 1,000, the entire building is going to be classified as an assembly occupancy. Now, there are going to be some exemptions to Rule 10.3 and when the acts apply. First, we're going to look at farm buildings. So, state statute has that the provisions of the act regulating the practice of architecture and engineering do not apply to the construction, remodeling, alteration, or renovation of farm buildings. And so farm buildings are defined as an agricultural building that's defined in the state building code as a structure designed and constructed to house farm implements, hay, grain, poultry, livestock, and other horticultural products. This bolded here is what's going to be important. The structure shall not be a place of human habitation or a place of employment where agricultural products are processed, treated, or packaged, nor shall it be a place used by the public. So if you have a building that looks like a barn or a shed, but are used for hosting a reception, wedding, things of that nature, those are not going to be exempt. That's considered a place used by the public. It's being used for something other than that structure used to house farm implements, the hay grain, everything stated above. Next exemption, there are some exemptions for trades. State statute identifies other legally recognized trades as exempt from requiring licensees. So, for example, a licensed mechanical, electrical, plumbing tradesperson doing work in their scope who is competent to do that work would be exempt from the act, meaning you wouldn't be required to retain a professional engineer to design that work. And it's also important to note that that qualified member does not represent themselves to be practicing architecture and engineering, or that they don't represent themselves to be an engineer or architect. So for Board Rule 10.6, if a responsible building official finds a hazard to life, health, safety, welfare, if there's an unusual circumstances of the building or structure, maybe an unusually large number of potential occupants in relation to the square footage, for a particular occupancy, they may require plans and specifications to be designed and prepared by a licensee. Local jurisdictions can be more strict than the act. They just can't be less strict. So if the work comprises of the practice of engineering and architecture and the work is not exempt on the act based on what we just went over, design professional is going to be required on your project. So lastly, for this section, we're going to discuss when a design professional is needed on a renovation or addition to an existing building, structure, or work. So renovations and one-level additions to an existing building, structure, or work are exempt from the Act if, one, that total impacted area is less than the occupancy classification. So you'll want to go back to that occupancy classification chart. And the area of renovation or addition does not adversely impact the mechanical system, electrical system, has structural integrity, egress, and it doesn't come into conflict or change the occupancy classification of the existing or adjacent tenant space, building, structure, or work. So when we say adversely impact, some things that could adversely impact a renovation or addition are going to be moving walls or doorways, HVAC updates or changes, structural updates, additions, electrical updates, or for changing an occupancy. So we're going to look at a renovation example. So we have a 5,000 square foot business occupancy. The owner wants to renovate half the building. They're going to add in 2 offices and a restroom. So here we have a renovation space of 2,500 square feet. So that first number one we looked at is that renovation space is over the occupancy square footage maximum. The exemption level for business occupancy is 3,000 square feet. Since that renovation space is 2,500, it's not over that, so we're good on that aspect. Now, second question, are we adversely impacting that mechanical, electrical, or structural systems? Are we changing egress? So for this, those exterior doors and windows are going to stay the same. However, a structural beam within the 2,500 square foot renovation space that supports the entirety of that building is being moved. Therefore, now we're adversely impacting the structure of that whole building, and licensees may now need to be involved. We're going to look at an example of an addition. So again, that first question is that additional space over that occupancy square footage maximum. This is going to be, both are business, classified as business occupancy. So that additional space, 2,500, like we just said, maximum square footage for business occupancy is less than 3,000, so we're still good. Are we changing or adversely impacting that mechanical, electrical, structural, or changing any egress? He's saying that this building is being built with its own structural support in mind. It has separate mechanical and electrical. We're not changing any egress. So based on this information, more than likely a design professional may not need to be involved. So let's say that the 2 buildings share a structural wall, electrical and mechanical systems, and where those 2 buildings are going to come together, the exterior door is changed to an interior door. More than likely, a design professional will need to be involved. Now we're adversely impacting that structural, electrical, mechanical, and we're changing that egress. All right, so now that we've discussed when we need those design professionals on a building project, we've looked at those exemptions, renovations, additions, new building projects. We're going to look at that avoiding design practice to help know how to avoid crossing the line into the unlicensed practice. So first, what is a design? State statute defines a design as the preparation of schematics, layouts, plans, drawings, specifications, calculations, and other diagnostic documents which show the features of an architectural or engineering project. So any of these services, if the project is subject to the Act, these services are to be provided only by licensed design professionals. So again, for architecture, they look at those ADA codes, potential historical requirements, aesthetics, other things of that nature. In engineering, they look at the math, calculated weight of materials, physics behind the structure, structural elements, snow loads, HVAC. So there are a variety of ways that designs can be produced. The most important aspect is if any of these show the features of an architectural or engineering project. So a common service provided by lumberyards is a cost estimate. If you work in the lumberyard industry, of course, you know, this is going to be where those lumberyard professionals calculate the cost of wood and building materials required for a specific construction or project. This is going to ensure that the builder gets exactly what they need and minimize the waste. Our board rule 1054 has the estimate of the cost of construction work, including the extent of the cost of changes in the work by construction companies, does not constitute the practice of architecture and engineering.
Let me add something here
Sure.
to this. So this rule is kind of in a set of rules back in chapter 10 that kind of a lot of them deal with construction companies, right? And contractors and how they construct projects that are designed by licensed architects and engineers. And 1054 is really talking about when a contractor gets a, they bid on a set of plans, to be built, right? Let's say there's a new school going up. The contractor got the bid, they're going to build it. And so any estimates that they prepare to, kind of give the owner and the licensees and whoever else the estimate of what that work is going to cost, or maybe they're developing that cost in their bidding process, right? That's essentially all this rule is saying, is that the estimate of the cost of construction work, identifying the scope, preliminary schedules and sequences to actually carry out that construction work, evaluating subcontractors and suppliers. All of that is not the practice of engineering or architecture. And again, it's essentially saying, this set of rules is saying, most everything the contractor is doing to build a project that constitutes the practice of engineering or architecture is not the practice of engineering and architecture, and the contractor is not going to, run afoul of the E&A Act for building something that was designed by licensees. So that's essentially what this rule is kind of saying, and that whole set of rules in Chapter 10, Section 5.
Thanks, John.
Yep. Todd, let me hold on. Todd's got a question related to 1054. Did estimate deliverables that the contractor is bidding off of need to be prepared? No, I don't believe so. Yeah, I think this 1054 is directly talking to Todd's question that says, the contractor doesn't need to have that estimate done by an architect or engineer. They can do it themselves, and what they're doing is not the practice. So, yeah.
All right, so when presented with an idea for a building project, this equation below is going to help you determine whether that design professional is needed. So going over, knowing if that constitutes the practice of architecture and engineering, knowing that occupancy classification and the square footage related to each one, seeing if there are any exemptions for farm buildings or trades or renovations and additions. Knowing all that's going to be very, very important to knowing if you're going to need a design professional on your project, or knowing if it is something that you are able to design yourself. And again, if you are unsure, it's always best to contact a licensed design professional. So next we're going to take a look at the complaint process and investigations. Just kind of see what happens if the board receives a complaint regarding the unlicensed practice. So state statute, this is going to go over the prohibited acts and penalties. I'm going to list them all out here. Maybe pretty obvious, but when we are on the topic we're discussing, number one is going to be that the most applicable. That practice or offer to practice architecture engineering without proper licensure, again, unless that project is exempt. So if you violate any of these, it can be a class 1 misdemeanor for your first offense and a class 4 felony for a second or subsequent offense. So the board partners with other state agencies and officials. Here you can see we work with local building officials, DHHS, State Fire Marshal, Department of Water, Energy, and Environment. Our mission is to protect life, health, and property and to promote public welfare. And we want to ensure that we're getting the correct information to the correct people so that the public is best informed and served. So how to file a complaint. Anyone can file a complaint with the board for a potential violation of the act or board rules. We receive these from a variety of means. We get it through members of the public, professionals in the building industry, other state agencies, professional societies, and organizations. Like we said, anyone can file a complaint, even if you are an out-of-state resident, and all of the information is going to be anonymous. So you're just going to want to complete that complaint form, which is going to be available on our website. You're going to detail the alleged violation, who is involved, in the project address, if there is one. You're going to make sure that you include as much information as possible. Make sure there's any contracts, technical documents, or other evidence supporting your complaint. Submit that along with the form. Again, that information is not going to be public. So once you've got that all completed and have all the supporting documents, if applicable, you can email it to our board's compliance officer or mail it in. And if there is an anonymous complaint, we typically will not investigate it unless it discloses evidence of an immediate threat to the health, safety, and welfare. So here is where you can find that complaint form and more information on the complaint process under the enforcement tab and the enforcement complaints. It's going to go over how to file a complaint as well as the remediation process, which we will touch on here just in a little bit. So once we receive a complaint of an alleged violation of the act, our compliance officer is going to reach out to the complainant to gather some more information, as well as contact the respondent. Again, they're going to do both of these to gather some more information about the complaint. They may visit the project site if necessary. And then once they gather all the information, it will be presented to the board. At that point, the board can close the complaint or they can initiate a case and continue investigating. So state statute has our disciplinary actions authorized as well as civil penalties. If a violation is found, the board may take one or more disciplinary actions. Excuse me, let me back up. So following a hearing and sufficient evidence, the board may, by 2/3 majority vote, determine that a person or organization has violated the act or related rules. And so then if a violation is found, the board may take one or more disciplinary actions by 2/3 majority vote. So you can see here, they have a list of options available. They can issue a censure reprimand, suspend judgment, revoke, suspend, or cancel licensure, issue a cease and desist. Typically, the board doesn't take action. That's not the goal. The goal is to bring awareness to the public and about the practice of architecture and engineering and when a design professional is required on a project. However, if someone chooses to continue to violate the act, disregard board rules, the board does have the ability to take action against that respondent.
And I will add a couple things here to this. So as far as the penalties go, it's rare that the board goes through a formal process.
Yeah.
A lot of times if the board is forced to take disciplinary action in a situation, we try to do that through settlement agreement. The board agrees to do this and the respondent agrees to do this. That's typically always disciplinary action. There's very few exceptions to that. And the other aspect of disciplinary action is when it comes to a building project and the board has found that, the owner maybe wasn't aware of the board, surprise, surprise, right? They're not aware of the board, they're not aware of the E&A Act that says their project should have licensees involved in the design. So the board has that process to bring those folks on through mediation, which Allison's going to talk about here a little bit. So the board doesn't like to take disciplinary action against owners. It's really only the stubborn ones that say, nope, I don't want to follow the law, that it is kind of forced to take disciplinary action in those cases. So just wanted to add that, Allison.
Yes. That's a very good point. The board is not a punitive board. Like I said, we want to bring awareness to the board when design professionals are required. So. And then for the cost of noncompliance, following the act can help Nebraska citizens and licensees so they comply with state law, protect their property, protect people on and using their property, and then help them prevent damage or liability from improperly constructed buildings and save money on time and projects. So then project owners and developers may be liable if a structure was built in violation of the act, and they could be subject to those fines, civil penalties. And additionally, like John said, if we go through those disciplinary actions, whether it be through a settlement agreement or a hearing, it will be reported to NCARB and NCWS. So we're going to go through a few case studies of some examples of lumberyards designing, usually mostly building layouts. But first, I know we just mentioned a little bit ago remediation. So we're going to mention it here in a few of these cases. So just want to touch a little bit on it. When we say remediation, this is going to be involving the project owner engaging an architect or a professional engineer to review the project to identify concerns to public safety, health, and welfare, excuse me. So if a project is found to be non-compliant with the act, if they don't have a design professional on it, the board has the option to order remediation for the project if it isn't exempt from the act. So like we said, they'll engage either an architect and or professional engineer, and if deficiencies are identified, that remediation professional will recommend design solutions to remedy the issue. And so that project owner must remove the deficiencies identified by the design professional. So then once that project's been remediated, that remediation professional will complete a final letter to the board stating so. If no deficiencies are found, the remediation professional will inform the board and the complaint will typically be closed. And then going back up to the bullet above, once the project has been remediated and we get that final letter, more likely that complaint is typically closed as well. All right, so the first case study we're going to look at, we have the construction of a single-story, 3,520 square foot assembly occupancy that was designed by a lumberyard. That maximum building area for assembly is 1,000 square feet, so it is over that square footage maximum. When looking at the plans, those included structural beams, putting in those structural beams and means of egress. When looking at those technical documents, licensees were not involved in the preparation. The board reviewed the project and determined it constituted the practice of architecture and engineering and that it wasn't exempt from the act based on its size and occupancy. Minimum construction phase services were not being provided on this project, so design professionals were able to be engaged. We'll touch a little bit on construction phase services, I believe, after this case study. So then, because of that, and the person practicing hadn't had any prior disciplinary action, the board found no formal administrative or legal action was warranted and chose to issue them a letter of caution and inform them to use greater care to avoid any repetition of such activities. And then as a result of this didn't just affect the lumberyard, it's also going to affect whoever the project owner is as well, because then now their project has to be remediated on itself, is separate from this matter, and then it has to be remediated. So when we say construction phase services, we're talking about making sure that we have projects that are subject to the act, making sure that they have licensed architects and professional engineers on them. And so then property owners who have a project on their property that is subject to the act and haven't engaged a Nebraska licensed design professional for the project could be engaged in the unlicensed practice. So kind of like we said before, as a lumberyard designing plans for customers, engaging in the unlicensed practice doesn't just affect that lumberyard. It's also going to affect that customer who will then now have to go through the remediation process. However, it also states that when property owners are no longer practicing architecture and engineering when they engage that architect or professional engineer who provides, or persons under their direct supervision as well is included in that, provides the minimum construction phase services, or that project is exempt from the act. Then when we say construction phase services, minimum construction phase services include having those regular site visits to determine that work is proceeding generally in accordance with those technical submissions that have been approved and those documents that had already been submitted to the building official at permit issuance. And these construction phase services must be completed by architects, professional engineers, or persons under the direct supervisions of licensed architects or professional engineers, as a reminder. That minimum construction phase services does also include processing those technical submissions. Oh, excuse me. Got ahead of myself. Processing technical submissions required of the contractor under the contract documents. So second case study, have another assembly, construction of a two-story building. That's an assembly occupancy of 15,677 square feet. That was designed by a lumber yard, and assembly maximum is 1,000 square feet. When looking at the building plans, that included a bar, tables, restrooms, storage, stairs, means of egress, so a lot of interior layout. So again, no licensees were involved throughout the preparation of technical documents. Board reviewed the project, determined it constituted the practice of both architecture and engineering and wasn't exempt. We were able to get design professionals engaged as minimum construction phase services weren't being provided. Again, with this one, there have been no prior disciplinary action, so the board didn't take any disciplinary action, no formal administrative or legal action, and issued a letter of caution to use greater care to avoid any repetition of such activities. And then again, that project designed was separate from this matter and had to be remediated on its own. So these are very similar, but two different designs. One was looking really at structural and egress, and this one was looking more at the interior layout, as well as also means of egress and being a two-story building. So the last case study I wanted to touch on wasn't designed by a lumberyard. It was designed by an unlicensed draftsperson. And this is going to touch a little on that plan stamping, which is still a pretty common issue. So we have a single story new construction, 6,800 square feet, assembly occupancy. Again, like we all know now, assembly is 1,000 square feet. So in this case, the unlicensed draftsperson prepared those technical documents for the project, and a licensed design professional was brought in only at the end of the project for cursory review. And then that licensee was the one who actually sealed those documents for submission to local building departments and permitting authorities. So when we say plan stamping, this is a common practice where licensees are brought in at the end of the project to give that cursory review of those technical documents and stamp the plans for that submission to those building departments and permitting authorities. So once reviewed, board determined it did constitute the practice of architecture and engineering and wasn't exempt. They hadn't had minimum construction phase services provided yet. This was a first offense and they had no prior disciplinary action. Again, no formal administrative or legal action. They issued that letter of caution to use greater care to avoid any repetition of such activities. And again, that project had to be remediated on its own. So direct supervision of work is required. This is a responsibility of licensees for providing this direct supervision of work for projects they are assigned to. So to exercise this responsible control, a supervising licensee must have authority to review, modify, reject, or approve work in progress and final deliverables for continuous oversight, be personally familiar with project scope, requirements, limitations, and special conditions, be able to explain and defend professional decisions, make sure they have that sufficient knowledge and proficiency, and be satisfied with completed work and accept full responsibility for that project.
One of the key things here for plan stamping is that first bullet that says they have to be involved, have the authority to review or modify the work, both in progress and the final work product. So they have to show or prove to the board, if there's a question, that they were involved at the beginning of the project and all throughout the life of it. So that's the key rule that allows us to enforce plan stamping and when that occurs.
Right. All right. So lastly, you're coming up on just a few minutes left. We're just going to cover some resources and materials available. So we got our licensee lookup feature that is updated weekly. I should have this on the next slide. It'll show a screenshot where they can search by a type of design professional. They can search for a professional engineer, architect, or an organization. They can search for PEs by their discipline. Next, we have our resources. So Nebraska Professional is going to be our monthly digital newsletter with important board updates. We include professional society updates and helpful articles related to the Act. Our Lunch and Learn webinar series, again, we're held quarterly. That also is going to have those past webinars, as well as the PowerPoint presentation, YouTube videos, publications. Those are going to have the brochures and handbooks, as well as the order materials button. Latest news, typically we'll have our upcoming webinars, important board updates, open positions, if we have a rules hearing coming up. And so here's going to be that publications. This is going to have, like I said here, you're going to have your handbook. That's going to be a handy resource, as well as down here before you build. These are probably going to be our most common publications that are requested. And we have all of our other brochures and materials available here. If you want hard copies, hit that order materials button down there. That'll pop up an email to me and I will gladly send them to you for free. Just let me know who, where, and how many you would like. FAQ section goes over several sections for the public licensees and students, as well as just a general brief section on when an architect or professional engineer is needed on a project. And lastly, the contact page. This is going to have all board staff information and the areas they're responsible for, as well as their emails and phone numbers. It'll also just have our generic website, phone number, and physical and mailing address. So we want to make sure we are as available to you guys as needed if you guys ever have any questions or needs or concerns. that will be a great place to start and find who you need to get in contact with. We have our social media pages here. If you want to follow along, a lot of the time we'll be sharing important, like I said, important board updates, any upcoming rules changes, any national organization updates, things of that nature. So that's a really great place to keep in touch as well. And we are at 1 o'clock on the nose. I don't think I've ever actually done that, so that is very impressive. So, were there any other questions that we wanted to address, or?
Doesn't appear to Chris's question, he talks about an EI can perform, I think he's talking about site visits. Again, I believe the way the statute is written that, and the rules are that as long as the licensee is meeting all the direct supervision rules for construction phase services, I think they can perform those. But again, they have to prove that they're exercising the correct amount of direct supervision as set forth by Rule 6.4. Yeah, and unfortunately, I have to drop off for another presentation or another webinar at meeting at 1 o'clock, so I have to stop answering questions.
Well, if you guys have any other questions, go ahead and feel free to put in the chat box or shoot me an email, and I'd be more than happy to answer them for you or find someone who knows better. We can bug John a little bit after this too. So again, thanks everyone for attending. Again, I'll be sending out those attendance verifications via email here shortly. Again, you're not going to get a certificate, and that's okay. Just use that attendance verification email if you would like to submit for continuing education hours. So thank you everyone for attending. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.